I thought we were going to get killed. I thought we were just going to get hacked to pieces or shot, you know, through the head with an arrow. It's been a fair amount in the media about people going against the advice that's been given to everyone in order to, you know, curb the spread of coronavirus. And when I grew up, I went to boarding school. I was lucky enough to go to a boarding school, but weirdly, because you weren't there with your mum and dad, you developed this kind of code of conduct, which was I would live my life based on what I could get away with. And it was fun. And Plan A, deny everything, was our motto. And we would, in our little privileged setup in our boarding house, we would absolutely we would break every rule that it was possible to break, deliberately doing things like smashing windows and stuff, because we knew we could get away with it. And weirdly, I grew up through the military in my 20s, and post that as well, living a life based on what I could get away with. I was a rubbish partner for past girlfriends, again, because I didn't have a moral code. I didn't have what I now refer to as a moral compass, really. Life seemed fun. I lived for the moment. I had a laugh. I got drunk a lot. I went to parties. I was spontaneous. I was funny. I was a bit of a hand grenade. And through life you grow up, don't you? And for me, the biggest catalyst for change ever was walking the length of the Amazon. And I actually only did it, probably realistically, because I was escaping. Got myself into trouble. Don't need to go into details, but you know, it was a bit of an escape. And it was on that expedition, which was essentially designed for somewhat selfish, egotistical reasons. I just wanted to beat my chest in my 20s, but in my early 30s actually I was by then, about how tough I was. So, you know, I thought, let's try and get the Guinness World Record for being the first person to walk the length of the Amazon. No harm in that, but equally no point in that either. I mean, utterly pointless expedition. So I was walking with a forestry worker called Cho, and Cho agreed to walk with me for 5 days initially, but he enjoyed walking with me, so he continued on, and we became good friends. And by this point, we'd probably been walking together for about 2 months. And Cho and I came into an area of very, very closed-off Amerindian tribes. They were Ashaninka Indians at the time. Because the Ashaninka Indians had been hit hard by the Shining Path, the communist guerrillas that swept through in the 80s and 90s, they'd actually fought back against this communist movement that had swept through the country. And Fujimori was the president at the time. He'd armed all the Ashaninka Indians, and they fought back violently. But they still lived in a state of defensiveness, even when I walked through, which was 2008. Anyway, as a result, there's still a radio network between all the little Ashaninka villages. They're thatched buildings without even any sides on them often, and people sleep in hammocks or sleep on the floor on palm mats. Incredibly basic communities. Not many people use money, but because of this atrocities that happened a couple of decades before, they've got this HF radio system, so there's a communication system between the villages. And I called ahead to a village downstream, and the response that came back was, if a white person walks through, we'll kill him immediately. It never failed to make me paranoid. I was a nail-biting, somewhat depressed person at this time, because I'd just been faced with so many of these threats. Cho was a very supportive person, had a good sense of humour, could always see the light side of things. And he said to me, look, Ed, rather than just stop and obviously not walk through this village, there's a big island in the middle of the river. It's about 1 kilometre or so long. I can paddle out. We've got these inflatable boats, paddle out to the island, walk 1 kilometre, sneak round this village, and at the downstream end of the island, paddle back across and carry on walking. Everything's going to be fine, isn't it? So we did that. This was the great ingenious plan. So we paddle out, inflated our little raft, to paddle out to the island, walk the length of this sort of shingle island in the middle of the Amazon River, and right at the downstream end of the island, as we're about to jump back in our boats, Joe just said, Ed, look behind you. And there was, again, I've told this story so many times, sometimes the details change in my head, but there's about 5 dugout canoes coming towards us. The men in the dugout canoes were stood up and they had bows and arrows trained on us. The women were sat down and they had machetes and they were coming towards us, and they beached, and they were furious, and they just ran towards us. And because we were at the end of this island, and I'd made a point during this expedition not to be armed at all, I thought we were going to get killed. I thought we were just going to get hacked to pieces or shot, you know, through the head with an arrow. That it's weird to describe how you deal with a situation like that. There's so many nuanced things that your brain automatically does. Everything slowed down, a bit like if there's a car crash. And I think when the adrenaline starts pumping into your system, the perception of time slows down because you're given this survival opportunity to make more decisions, make more calculations than you do in normal everyday life when your life isn't dependent on it. And these guys were furious, and I remember sort of getting out this permit which we'd got that gave us permission to walk through this area. But you know, I was dealing with a tribal group that I'm 99% sure all of them were illiterate, so it was just a piece of nonsense paper, and yet they were furious, so that I know I couldn't just smile and be goofy, because that would be showing lack of respect. I know I couldn't be weak and vulnerable, because again then they would have the upper hand. And there was this fine balance of reading their faces, reading their anger, picking the people within the group who I thought was more receptive to sort of reasoning. Eventually they detained us, they took us back to their village. 3-4 hours of questioning, went through all of our rucksacks, stole quite a few things like machetes that were useful to them. It was only when they were taking out things like satellite internet links and MacBook computers and satellite phones, they became so fascinated in the things that I was carrying that they kind of weirdly forgot to be angry, which was useful to me. Eventually, long story short, the chief, who was called Andreas, and his brother, who's called Alfonso, agreed to walk with us. And because we'd gone through all of these sort of long debates with the village, I made out this was a bit of a concession, and yet it was brilliant for me, because suddenly I was walking through this very, very difficult area of Peru where people didn't necessarily want outsiders, because they live in this constant state of alertness against intruders and coca farmers who want to push them off their land, and petroleum prospectors who also want to do the same thing. And yet suddenly I had 2 guys who were locals who were prepared to walk with me, and I thought they'd walk for about 3 days, but they ended up walking for 47 days with me, and made brilliant friends with them, and we would laugh. But one of the things that happened on day 1 walking with them was they soon realized that sometimes you have to cross the main channel of the Amazon River. There's just a big thicket of bamboo or razor grass, or the village doesn't want you to go through, so you just literally have to inflate the pack raft and paddle across to the other side. Now Alfonso and Andreas took we had 2 one-man pack rafts, and we now had 4 people. So Cho and I took one, and Alfonso and Andreas took the other, and they realised very quickly, because they're not stupid, that if they paddled less hard, they'd drift downriver, and they'd end up having to walk less far, because they'd get out on the other side, way down the river. And it started to annoy me, and I tried to convey, my Spanish was really poor at the time, that they couldn't do this. I was doing an expedition called Walking the Amazon. I needed to walk every metre of the Amazon in order to do this. And at lunchtime we had a word with them, and I thought they'd understood, but then in the afternoon they kept doing it again. And by the end of the day, I think we'd probably drifted downriver, I kid you not, about 5 or 6 kilometres. So a huge amount of time, and my shoulders were tense, and I couldn't help but be angry and frustrated at them, even though they were helping me, and even though they didn't understand. I got really angry and frustrated because we were cheating. I was meant to be walking the Amazon, and yet it wasn't happening. And I said to Cho, we can't let this happen again. If these guys are continuing walking with us, we've got to make them understand that we've got to paddle straight across. And Cho said, no, it's not that we can't let this happen again. We need to do the whole of today again. We need to repeat the day. And immediately he said it, I smiled and I agreed. And I could feel the tension dissipate from my shoulders. And in the end, it took us about a week to redo one day. We had to find, you couldn't paddle upstream. The river was too far. So we had to find a little boat with an outboard motor and enough fuel and a man to paddle it, to drive us upstream, to drop us off at the beginning of that day. And then we actually walked down the banks again, so that we'd done that day. It took about a week to redo that one day. And yet it was the biggest lesson of my life. And I was 33 at the time, of the concept of trusting your gut feeling. And immediately I knew that we were doing the right thing. I relaxed, and my shoulders relaxed, and just in my heart, my humour came back. And it just felt right. And it didn't matter that it was going to cost more, and it didn't matter it was going to take more time, because I could then hold my head up high and say that we'd walk the full length of the Amazon River. And I don't know whether most people grow up with parents that instill this sense of doing the right thing in their children. And I think, unfortunately, you know, we've gone through so many evolutions in humanity in terms of how aware we are as parents, and I think even my generation of parents didn't necessarily have such a handle on things like psychology and child psychology as we do now, and so there were holes in their parenting. And anyway, I certainly grew up partly because of boarding school, actually, but with a sense of no idea of what was right or wrong. If someone dared me to do something, I would just do it, and that was both volatile and unstable. And there's no rules if that happens, and you are such an unstable character. You're not reliable, you're not trustworthy, because you don't have a code of conduct. And then, to this day, it was a lesson to me. I just suddenly realised the benefits in being honest, in doing the right thing, in not having anything to hide, in not having anything to sort of convince somebody that you're doing the right thing or whatever. And I bring this all up because if you are the type of person who is flaunting this because you can, because the police can't police this completely, can they? And because you can come up with a reason on the spot that makes it sound like you're out of the house for a valid reason when actually you're not. I think you need to tap into your inner sense of what's right and wrong. I think everyone does, and I think most of society are doing that at the moment. And then there's a minority who are like the younger version of myself, who are just taking the piss, if I'm honest. And to them, I've told this long waffling story because it matters. And actually, life is so much more simple if you do the right thing, and it is so much more rewarding if you do the right thing. And then suddenly, you do actually become a sort of person that your friends can rely on and depend on, and you become marriage material at long last. And so I don't think I would have been a good husband or a good father if I hadn't gone through this personal evolution of just checking in with myself whenever there's a tough decision. Does this feel dodgy? In that case, I'm not going to do it. Does this feel wholesome and right? And if everyone knew about it, would I be bothered? And if the answer is no, and it does feel right, then it's probably the right thing to do. And if it does feel dodgy and it just feels edgy and you can feel that tension come in, then it's not the right thing. And going out right now of your house, unless it is for exercise or to go to essential work or to get food or for medical reasons, is not the right thing to do. Stay at home.